Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into a subject that is simultaneously controversial, academically fascinating, and occasionally just plain weird: the private life of the Middle Ages. Specifically, medieval intimacy. This was an era defined by high-flown concepts of chivalry and highly questionable herbal remedies. It was a time when expressing desire often meant making polite requests and then spending an inordinate amount of time trying to confirm that absolutely no one was watching. Before we proceed, please do the usual: like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I'm putting out here. Also, share in the comments where you're watching from and what local time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our audience spread across different ***. Scene start: flickering candlelight on parchment. Upbeat, slightly mischievous medieval-style music swells and then fades. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Middle Ages, where life was short, teeth were optional, and the smell was, well, let's just say memorable. We're picking up where we left off, discussing the messy reality of medieval life, where even the simplest transactions were complicated. Now, apparently, even services, which were detailed, mind you, with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for drawing up a war treaty, had wildly varying entrance fees, despite the fact that those involved often swore oaths that were meant to prohibit such activities. It's the Middle Ages, folks. Rules are suggestions, and oaths are mostly for show. Sometimes, customers didn't even pay in coin. They'd show up with eggs, or wool, or some other kind of bizarre bartered goods. This was definitely not the Middle Ages of charcoal briquettes, unless you count the ones they were using to try and scrub their teeth. It was an economy built on stuff, and sometimes that stuff was slightly smelly poultry. Now, let's set the stage. A flickering glow from a tallow candle, maybe a gentle breeze whistling through the gaps in the thatched roof. Your beloved removes their woolen tunic, unleashing a potent cloud of powerful, unmistakable medieval musk. When it came to personal hygiene in medieval Europe, priorities were, shall we say, fluid. Maintaining hygiene was important, sure, but it ranked firmly behind surviving the latest bout of plague, fixing the hole in the roof, or, crucially, finding and extracting the pig that had once again wandered into the kitchen. These were the real emergencies. Bathing did happen, of course. We aren't talking about a complete aversion to water, but it happened with a frequency far less than modern standards would suggest. Peasants generally bathed about once a month. That is, unless they accidentally fell into a river, which probably counted as their quarterly deep clean. Soap was either painstakingly homemade or, if you were lucky, imported. It was expensive, and therefore, it was used sparingly, the medieval equivalent of only using your good china on Christmas. Public baths were available in towns and cities, offering a communal experience that sounds delightful, until you realize they were often shut down during periods of disease or scandal, or, in a truly unfortunate confluence of events, both simultaneously. Did you catch the plague, or did you just get caught doing something scandalous in the communal tub? The local gossips would have a field day trying to figure it out. For the wealthy, options were, naturally, far more luxurious. A hot bath could be prepared, aromatized with herbs, because nothing says luxury like smelling faintly of rosemary and regret, and then the bather would be scrubbed down by attendants using linen cloths. For those stuck in poverty, the sponge bath usually meant employing a cold bucket of water and secretly hoping that nobody noticed your particular aroma near the stables. To complicate matters further, water itself was sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some people genuinely believed that bathing too often could weaken the body or make the skin more susceptible to disease. Others, perhaps more realistically, just didn't have the time, access to a proper tub, or the inclination to fight the local geese who had already claimed the water source. Now, imagine trying to make a good first impression under these conditions. Perfume was a luxury reserved only for the very rich, the kind of people who needed to mask the smell of their expensive, but still slightly rancid, silks. Deodorant was a concept so far removed from reality it might as well have been a spaceship. Oral hygiene, if attempted at all, involved methods like rubbing the teeth with ash, a lovely abrasive treatment, or, if you were feeling slightly more refined, chewing on mint leaves. Sharing a kiss, therefore, was an absolutely adventurous undertaking. It was a commitment, a leap of faith, and possibly a mild health hazard. Clothing offered little assistance in these conditions. Layers of leather, linen, and fur served to trap heat, sweat, and every single odor encountered throughout the day, including the contents of the chamber pot and whatever mysterious stew was bubbling over the fire. Your tunic was essentially a mobile, organic time capsule of your day's activities, yet, despite all this, people still managed to fall in love, to flirt, and to get close. Perhaps their standards were simply different, or perhaps, when everyone smelled equally terrible, love truly was blind, and more importantly, noseblind. Moving on to the delicate matter of family planning. Regulating the size of a family in medieval Europe was like trying to drive a cart without reins or a cooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could reliably count on. To be clear, people tried. While birth control was nowhere near as effective as it is today, that doesn't mean medieval folks were unaware of the concept. They were keenly aware that certain actions led to pregnancy, and many went to great lengths, sometimes confusingly so, to prevent it. Some of the more scientific approaches involved herbal concoctions, animal membranes, which we won't dwell on, and rituals that included burying specific objects near the threshold of the house. You know, just in case the fertility spirits were passing by and needed a gentle hint to move along. One well-documented method, which sounds absolutely delightful, involved drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Yes, beaver testicles. The logic here is lost to history, but the sheer commitment to this vile brew is impressive. Others suggested wearing amulets blessed by someone who, hopefully, wasn't just guessing. A few guides even suggested that bouncing energetically after intimacy might be beneficial. At the very least, it probably burned off a few calories. Early barrier techniques also existed, though calling them reliable would be an overstatement. One approach involved soaking linens in various mixtures. A few brave souls experimented with wax, and there are references to what might be the medieval precursors to modern latex devices. But please, don't ask about the manufacturing process. You really don't want to know. The Church, naturally, was not pleased. Any attempt to prevent conception was generally viewed as sinful or unnatural. The primary purpose of marriage was procreation, and anything that interfered with this sacred duty was usually frowned upon, or, more often, loudly condemned from the pulpit. Yet, not everyone adhered to the religious counsel. Among married couples, particularly those facing financial hardship, the desire to space out pregnancies or simply avoid adding another dependent was deeply sincere. Similarly, among unmarried partners, the incentive could be even stronger. But regardless of the approach, the efficacy was usually unreliable. Contraceptive methods, primitive as they were, relied on folk remedies, local herbs, and a whole lot of optimism. When these methods failed, which was frequently, it usually led to hurried marriages, secretive pregnancies, and a great deal of uncomfortable discussion. Contrary to what church authorities might have claimed, not every medieval couple abstained until the wedding day. In fact, testing premarital compatibility was so common that it is extensively documented, often labeled as fornication in church records and viewed as a breach of social etiquette in local gossip circles. While premarital intimacy was certainly not universally accepted throughout historical times, it was definitely closely monitored. In many towns and villages across Europe, local authorities kept moral records, which were less like personal diaries and more like registers of shame. That if a couple was caught or suspected of premarital sexual activity, they could be summoned to the local court and required to pay a fine. These fines sometimes benefited the church, sometimes the municipality, and sometimes they were claimed by the people who reported the transgression. Reporting such offenses was a common practice in medieval society, a form of lucrative, pious snitching. The amount of the penalty could vary depending on whether it was the couple's first offense, whether a pregnancy had resulted, or whether the couple eventually married. In some cases, marrying later could nullify the penalty entirely, functioning as a kind of retroactive approval. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate, an early payment discount for sin. Then there were the social consequences. In tightly knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So, even if the local priest was lenient, the neighbors might be less forgiving. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in the July heat. Interestingly, this situation led to a practice called handfasting, a form of informal betrothal where couples considered themselves engaged, and in some regions, this was deemed sufficient to start living together legally. The church later tried to close this loophole, but in the meantime, many medieval babies were technically born early. Among the peasantry, these matters were usually handled more practically. If a couple seemed serious and pregnancy was evident, a marriage was generally arranged, sometimes expedited by gentle persuasion or firm pressure from both families. In contrast, among the noble class, the consequences could be far more severe, especially where inheritance rights or reputation were concerned. In the Middle Ages, virginity was not just seen as a virtue, it was a contract clause, a political tool, and sometimes, a society-wide obsession. Among the rural population, expectations varied by region and circumstance. Generally, a young woman was assumed to be a virgin, at least officially, before marriage. If she wasn't, it usually raised eyebrows, and a small fine or a speedy, informal wedding could often resolve the issue, but for the aristocracy, the stakes were astronomical. The virginity of noble women was intimately tied to inheritance rights, political alliances, and family honor. A broken betrothal could lead to long-running feuds. An out-of-wedlock pregnancy could jeopardize generations of careful planning. So, how was this verified? Sadly, quite ineffectively. Sometimes, assessments relied on vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or mostly kept away from the stable boy. In other cases, more intrusive techniques were used, involving examinations by midwives or matrons. For instance, the principles of medieval life, particularly regarding the most intimate of human arrangements, must first be clarified. And when we talk about clarification in the Middle Ages, we mean wading through a swamp of theological bureaucracy and social hypocrisy. Medieval canon law, surprisingly, accepted the radical idea of consent in marriage. Yes, you heard that right. The Church, often portrayed as the ultimate killjoy, technically believed that a marriage was legitimate so long as it expressed the verbal agreement of both parties, even without a priest present. Think about that for a moment. Two individuals, standing in a muddy field somewhere, declaring, "Yes, I will," could technically be considered married. Romantic, perhaps. Legally ambiguous, certainly. A nightmare for modern divorce lawyers, absolutely, but the crucial point, the one that makes the whole concept crumble like old parchment, is this: merely accepting consent in principle did not, in fact, mean it was truly approved in reality. This was especially, and tragically, true for women, for noble girls. That precious concept of consent usually meant aligning her will precisely with the pre-planned agreements already hammered out by her family. Families negotiated marriages not as unions of hearts, but as diplomatic treaties, corporate mergers, or high-stakes land swaps. The young woman's opinion might have been politely solicited, a delicate cough in the corner of the negotiation room, or subtly implied through a series of increasingly pointed glances from her father. But ultimately, the dowry carried far more weight than her own voice. Her father's ledger was louder than her lament. That it's important to understand the hierarchy of value here. Love was a pleasant bonus, but political stability and a healthy transfer of sheep were non-negotiable. If she dared to object, she wasn't just defying her parents, she was threatening the entire strategic future of the barony. It was a lot of pressure to put on a 16-year-old who probably just wanted to read poetry and avoid smallpox. Among peasant women, the options were, ironically, slightly wider, if only because they had less property to complicate matters, yet they were still tightly bound by the suffocating pressures of the community. Refusing a suitable choice of partner could swiftly result in financial ruin or, worse, social exclusion. If you rejected the local blacksmith, you might freeze in the winter. If you rejected the miller, you might starve. But refusing a proposal from the local lord's son? That was far more dangerous, potentially leading to consequences that no amount of polite refusal could mitigate. And then there was the matter of consent within the marriage, which became terrifyingly ambiguous. Husbands possessed legal authority over their wives' bodies, and refusing their demands could be grounds for formal complaint or even annulment. This was the ultimate catch-22 of medieval matrimony. You consented to the marriage, and by doing so, you consented to everything thereafter, forever. Some church thinkers spoke of a marital debt, the debitum conjugal, which was likened to a shared bank account of intimacy. Both spouses owed it to the other. In theory, this sounds beautifully equitable. In practice, it was much less voluntary, resembling a bank account where only one partner held the withdrawal card, and the other was legally obliged to provide the deposit upon request. The debt was rarely called in by the wife, unless she was concerned about the continuation of the family line. The architect of clarity, Chrysippus. Now, let us turn our attention to the man who truly codified the chaos, who took the promising but somewhat floppy philosophical foundation laid by Zeno and turned it into the intellectual equivalent of a reinforced concrete bunker. We are talking about Chrysippus, the man who approached philosophy with a definitive, methodical, and frankly, rather intimidating precision. His main focus, his absolute obsession, was logic. In an era where many philosophers were content to rely on flowery rhetoric, emotional appeals, or simply shouting louder than the next guy, Chrysippus decided to build a system of reasoning that could stand shoulder to shoulder with Aristotle's, a feat that, frankly, required a significant amount of intellectual audacity and perhaps a slight lack of social skills. He had a deep, almost religious commitment to clarity. He believed, quite correctly, that for Stoicism to endure, it could not rely on mere charisma or the comforting weight of tradition. No, it had to be a structure that was logically sound, robust, and contained absolutely no loopholes or unnecessary ornamentation. It had to be airtight. Chrysippus was the one who sharpened the now famous Stoic distinction between things that are within our control and things that are decidedly outside of it. He took the existing teachings on ethics, metaphysics, and physics and forged them into a unified, explicitly challenge-proof framework. He was the great systematizer, the chief architect, the one who made sure all the philosophical plumbing worked perfectly. And what was the main takeaway from his rigorous system? Chrysippus argued, quite starkly, that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. You didn't need comfort. You didn't need companionship. You certainly didn't need that new chariot you were eyeing. In short, virtue was self-sufficient. It was the ultimate philosophical mic drop point. One of his most renowned, and perhaps most abstract, contributions was the concept of lectin. This was a concept that explored the meaning underlying words. He argued that in every verbal expression, there was an element of sayability, a piece of content conveyed through speech and connected to logic. This idea might sound incredibly abstract, the kind of thing only a dedicated academic could love, but it profoundly deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity. These, after all, were viewed as the essential components for living a good life. If you couldn't even articulate what you meant, how could you possibly live rationally? But here's the thing. Chrysippus wasn't just a figure of dry texts and dusty manuscripts. He possessed a sharp, often cynical, sense of humor. It is alleged that on one occasion, when confronted with the accusation that he himself failed to live up to his own rigorous teachings, because, let's be honest, who could? He shot back with a brilliant piece of rhetorical deflection. Would you blame a doctor if he falls ill? He still knows how to treat diseases. It's the perfect Stoic comeback. It reminds us that Stoicism was never about achieving flawless perfection right out of the gate. It was about the daily, grinding effort to narrow the distance between your ideals and your actual actions. It's about the struggle, not the immediate victory. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism was solidified. It ceased being merely a source of comfort for downtrodden merchants or a collection of poetic maxims. It became a rigorous discipline. It was a method to be learned, practiced, and used to overcome confusion and disorder. This discipline would soon transcend the borders of Greece and travel straight to the heart of Rome, where emperors and common folk alike would soon grapple with its profound influence. When philosophy met power, Stoicism in Rome. When Stoicism finally arrived in Rome, the philosophy itself had already evolved over centuries. But under Roman influence, this discipline transformed from a purely intellectual Greek pursuit into a practical, viable lifestyle suitable for statesmen, military leaders, and yes, even emperors. The ancient Romans, bless their practical, warmongering hearts, were generally not inclined toward theoretical metaphysics or intricate logical deduction. Their focus was relentlessly practical. Faced with constant wars, endless political intrigue, betrayal on a daily basis, and the ever-present threat of personal collapse, the Romans desperately sought a framework that could maintain their internal stability amidst overwhelming external chaos. Stoicism, with its emphasis on self-control and virtue during hard times, emerged as the perfect philosophical operating system for the Roman elite. It was mental armor, and they needed it desperately. Seneca, the influencer who couldn't quit his day job. And this is where Seneca the Younger strides onto the scene, philosopher, playwright, and the notoriously ill-fated advisor to the spectacularly unpredictable Emperor Nero. Seneca is a pivotal figure, a guide navigating this complex, morally ambiguous world. Now, Seneca was not born into hardship. He belonged to the wealthy upper class, was excellently educated, and was dangerously close to political power. Yet, his writings reveal a man acutely aware of life's fragility and the seductive lure of comfort. He was, in essence, the first philosophical influencer who preached minimalism while accumulating massive wealth. In his famous correspondence with Lucilius, Seneca championed moderation, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against the dangers of being ruled by emotions or desires. He was the original life coach telling you to ignore the noise. However, his own existence was a constant, agonizing tug-of-war between Stoic principles and political expediency. Despite advocating for simplicity, he amassed a fortune that would make a modern hedge fund manager blush. While championing virtues, he served as the chief apologist for a tyrant, Nero. But this internal conflict, rather than undermining his credibility, actually makes him more human, more accessible. Seneca never presented himself as a morally perfect figure. He was aware of his own contradictions, and that awareness only enhances his humanity and his realism. The guidance he offered others often contained an unspoken self-critique. "I am not a wise man," he confessed, "but I am a lover of the wise." Perhaps this humility is the most truly Stoic stance of all, not claiming complete mastery, but humbly seeking it, knowing the journey is the point. Epictetus, the ultimate underdog. While Seneca was delivering Stoic teachings to the elite, the 1%ers of the Roman world, another Roman was transmitting similar insights to a much wider audience, proving that philosophy wasn't just a hobby for the rich. Epictetus, a former slave, lived a life marked by poverty and physical disability. He owned nothing. He didn't even own himself for a time. Yet, he believed that true freedom sprang solely from the mind. "My leg may be shackled," he famously declared, "but even Zeus cannot dominate my thoughts." For him, life's difficulties were not obstacles, they were training grounds for developing virtue. They were the gym where you built your mental muscles. His teachings, preserved by his student Arrian, became the Enchiridion, the Stoic handbook focused entirely on internal liberation. He taught that the only thing that truly matters is your judgment about external events, not the events themselves. Lose your job. That's external. Your decision to react with calm dignity? That's internal. And that, he insisted, is where the power lies. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who wrote in his diary in Rome, Stoicism transcended mere theory. It became that mental armor we mentioned, and soon, that armor was worn by the man who ruled the known world. Marcus Aurelius that he was an emperor, a warrior, and, most unexpectedly, a philosopher king. That it is one thing to practice philosophy in peaceful contemplation. It is an entirely different matter to apply it in the midst of chaos. To do so on the front lines of conflict, on the borders of a massive empire, while simultaneously managing an empire that was, frankly, beginning to fall apart at the seams, that is a challenge of an entirely different magnitude. Born into immense wealth and privilege, Marcus Aurelius ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire in 161 AD. His reign was anything but easy. Plagues ravaged the empire. Germanic tribes pressed hard against the borders. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, died young. Military leaders betrayed his trust. And, most painfully, his own son, Commodus, turned into the very tyrant Marcus had desperately tried to prevent him from becoming. Talk about a parenting fail. Throughout all these trials, Marcus did not give speeches or issue propaganda. Instead, he wrote down his thoughts to himself. These intensely private reflections were later compiled into the collection we know today as Meditations. They were never intended for public consumption, yet they offer the most profound insight into a Stoic mind under pressure. They don't read like royal decrees. They sound like the gentle, yet firm, reminders of a tired individual trying desperately to remain steady. Every morning, he would essentially give himself a mental pep talk. He would tell himself, "Today, I will encounter interference, ingratitude, rudeness, betrayal, malice, and selfishness." This wasn't pessimism, it was a form of preparation. By anticipating difficulties, Marcus believed he could face them without losing his composure or reacting impulsively. Other people's actions were not personal insults to him, they were merely indicators of their own lack of understanding. His responsibility was not to fix others, but to control himself. That he frequently reminded himself that death could come at any moment, tomorrow, or even today. This was not a call to despair, but a call to clarity. Act now, with intention, not out of fear. Despite commanding armies and managing a vast empire, Marcus was profoundly preoccupied with his inner world. He believed that a person could remain untouched, even while in the very center of the storm, provided the mind remained rooted in logic and virtue. He rarely succumbed to cruelty. He was wary of luxury and excess. And while he occasionally struggled to fully internalize the Stoic principles, because who doesn't, he constantly returned to those ideals. Like a star guiding a ship through a tempest, Marcus Aurelius did not invent Stoicism. But in many ways, he embodied it more clearly than anyone who came before him. He demonstrated that Stoicism was not merely the domain of reclusive philosophers or overly zealous ascetics. It was accessible to everyone, even the most powerful individuals who yearned to bring peace to the chaos of life. The quiet retreat, Stoicism in the shadows. Yet, after Marcus, the philosophical spark of Stoicism began to dim. It wouldn't vanish entirely, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of tranquility. Following Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 AD, Stoicism did not disappear overnight, but it slowly faded. What was once central to Roman intellectual culture quietly slipped into the background. Part of this decline was political. Marcus's successor, Commodus, took over the empire and seemed determined to obliterate every Stoic virtue his predecessor had championed. Where Marcus represented self-control and wisdom, Commodus represented self-indulgence and spectacle. The Roman court devolved into a gaudy circus, and philosophy had no role in the show. Simultaneously, a new movement was emerging. As Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, eventually becoming the official religion, its teachings, rituals, and worldview started to displace the older philosophical schools. Where Stoicism encouraged self-reliance and resilience, Christianity emphasized divine grace and salvation. Where Stoicism taught acceptance of fate, Christianity focused on redemption and God's will. While these viewpoints were not always in conflict, Christian thinkers often viewed Stoicism as a noble but fundamentally pagan philosophy, admirable, but ultimately incomplete. Nevertheless, Stoicism did not die. It simply underwent a transformation, its core tenets slowly integrating into early Christian thought. Many early church fathers held the Stoic philosophers in high regard. Figures like Augustine, while criticizing Stoic pride, appreciated their sincere approach to ethics. Moreover, the monastic traditions, particularly within Christian asceticism, relied heavily on Stoic principles of discipline. Practices like silence, simplicity, the renunciation of luxury, and self-examination aligned closely with the teachings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the Middle Ages, Stoicism gradually became a subtle philosophical backdrop. It was respected by scholars, referenced by priests, but rarely practiced as a whole system. It was no longer a distinct public movement or a street-level school. Instead, it persisted on the margins, a faint influence maintained by writers, theologians, and the occasional curious individual, but endurance can sometimes surpass overt success. Stoicism's quiet perseverance ensured that when the intellectual environment shifted centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas were ready for revival. Despite its decline, Stoicism had the ancient art of not freaking out and taking responsibility for how you navigate your way through it. More than ever, individuals are embracing this clear, stark stance. Athletes rely on it to manage stress, because apparently winning a gold medal isn't stressful enough without adding a layer of existential dread. Veterans find the strength to process trauma, and leaders, perhaps those who actually manage to lead without succumbing to their own colossal egos, apply these principles daily. And then there are the youth, crushed under the relentless weight of constant comparison and digital chaos, who are somehow seeking guidance from Epictetus, the ancient self-help guru, as a source of support. The irony, of course, is delicious. We are so technologically advanced that we need a dead philosopher who lived 2 millennia ago to tell us to put the phone down. Naturally, no philosophy offers an instant solution. Let's be clear, you will still grieve, you will still encounter obstacles that make you want to scream into a pillow, and you will absolutely still lose your cool when the Wi-Fi cuts out. However, Stoicism provides a rare gift, a structure for recovery, reflection, and advancing your position. Ultimately, the goal isn't to achieve perfection, which is frankly exhausting and impossible. The goal is simply to make progress. In a world that constantly celebrates loud, performative success, perhaps the most revolutionary act of all is simply to stand still and think for a minute. The hygiene of Paris now. Let's pivot sharply from the mental discipline of Stoicism to the physical discipline of scraping yourself clean. To a modern observer, an ancient Roman bath might look like the ultimate luxury resort, and we're talking 5-star, all-inclusive, no expense spared luxury. Think marble floors that gleam like liquid silk, ceilings that soar so high they could host a small cloud, statues of the gods looking down with benign, judgmental gazes, and pools steaming in the morning sun, promising instant relaxation. But for a Roman, this wasn't a decadent holiday, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing was not an occasional luxury, something you saved up for your birthday. It was a daily habit, viewed by many as an indispensable part of Roman life. It was as necessary as checking your social media feed, only infinitely cleaner. At the height of the empire, Rome boasted over 900 public baths. 900. They ranged from the ridiculously ostentatious imperial complexes, the kind that made Versailles look like a garden shed, to the more modest neighborhood facilities, the ancient equivalent of your local community center, only with better plumbing. Everyone, from senators who spent their days pontificating about trivialities to artisans who actually built the city, took time out of their day to bathe. The importance of personal cleanliness was certainly immense. They didn't want to smell like a legionary after a long march, after all. But equally important was the rhythm of the experience. The daily routine, the social interactions, the enveloping warmth. The entire process was a conscious, deliberate performance. You would enter through the apoditorium, or the changing room. This was the first hurdle, where the more affluent individuals might have their slaves assist them in the delicate art of disrobing. From there, you would proceed to the tepidarium, a warm room designed specifically to loosen the muscles and initiate the process of relaxation. Think of it as the gentle warm-up before the main event. Next came the caldarium, the absolute heart of the bathing experience. Here, the heat and steam were crucial for relaxing both body and mind. This was a scorching, vaporous chamber, heated by a truly ingenious underfloor system called the hypocaust. In this area, bathers would sweat intensely, and I mean intensely. They would then scrape their skin using strigils, those curved metal instruments that look suspiciously like medieval torture devices, to remove the sweat, dirt, and oil. Occasionally, they might even indulge in a massage. Finally, after roasting and scraping themselves to within an inch of their lives, they would plunge into the frigidarium, the cold pool, designed to tighten the skin and shock the senses back into alertness. This sharp contrast between the intense heat and the bracing cold, the sweat and the chill, is what gave the ritual its true power. The Romans believed this practice improved circulation, digestion, and even one's overall mood, and frankly, they were probably right. It's the original hydrotherapy, just with more public nudity. Beyond the bubbles, the social network, but beyond mere hygiene and health, the baths served a far greater purpose. They were the community center, the town square, the original social media platform. This was the place to see and be seen. People didn't just wash, they conversed, they worked, they debated politics with the same fervor they used to scrub their backs, they sealed deals, or they simply caught up on the latest, juiciest gossip. Some patrons would arrive with their own personal musicians, providing a soundtrack to their scrubbing, while others brought snacks, turning the whole affair into a steamy, slightly bizarre picnic. Poets would recite their verses loudly, hoping to snag an audience, while philosophers argued under the vaulted ceilings, their profound thoughts punctuated by the splashing of water and the general hubbub of the crowd. In essence, a Roman bath served as a surprisingly democratic environment, at least by Roman standards. While social hierarchy was certainly acknowledged, even emperors might share a room with common citizens. Yes, slaves and women often faced restricted access or specific hours, a reminder that ancient democracy had its limits, but they were still an integral part of the daily environment. For the Romans, bathing was less about ostentation and more about routine, health, social interaction, and the collective rhythm of daily life. It was a space where the individual's subtle needs blended with the collective pulse of the empire, all wrapped up in a cloud of invigorating steam. The hypocentric heating system. Roman baths were not just aesthetically pleasing structures, they represented extraordinary feats of engineering. Long before modern saunas or underfloor heating systems were conceived, the Romans had developed methods to transform basic elements, brick, fire, and water, into a comprehensive environment for wellness. The heart of this innovation was the hypocaust system, an early, incredibly effective version of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves, the unsung heroes of Roman comfort, maintained a powerful furnace, or prefurnium. This raging fire heated the space beneath the raised floor, an area supported by small pillars called pili. The hot air circulated through this subfloor chamber, rising through flues embedded in the walls, gently and evenly distributing heat throughout the entire room, much like a sophisticated oven. The result was a continuous, enveloping warmth, crucially free from smoke and suffocating gases. Imagine that, centralized, clean heating 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile, we still complain when our apartment radiator makes a strange banging noise. The architectural design was equally meticulous. Arched ceilings helped trap the heat, while domed roofs diffused sound, preventing the whole place from turning into an echo chamber of scraping and splashing. The complex arrangement of rooms managed the flow of temperature, guiding bathers smoothly from the cooler apoditorium to the moderately heated zones, and finally into the intensely heated caldarium. Windows were strategically placed to capture the maximum amount of sunlight, enhancing the natural warmth. Water, the lifeblood of the operation, was constantly circulated, cleaned, and heated to precise standards. And let us not forget the aqueducts, those silent but vital components of the empire's success. These elevated stone channels brought vast quantities of water into the city, ensuring that even the most massive bath complexes could operate year-round. The most magnificent baths, such as those of Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of liters of water every single day. Despite this enormous demand, the system was so efficiently constructed that there was minimal waste, and the water flow remained remarkably stable. The water wasn't just for soaking either. The Romans also used it for steam rooms, saunas, and even the rudimentary flush toilets located nearby. Waste was carried away by underground sewage networks, powered entirely by gravity. The baths were not isolated architectural achievements, they were integral parts of a complex infrastructure, seamlessly integrated into the sprawling framework of Roman city life. Maintenance required constant effort. Artisans called furners supervised the furnaces, others maintained the pools, managed the supply of wood, or repaired the tiles and plumbing systems. The work was physically demanding, but the benefits were clear. These structures didn't just last a few years, many remained resilient and functional for hundreds of years. In an age devoid of electricity, industrial machinery, or digital thermostats, the Romans created an integrated environment of warmth, comfort, and smooth circulation that we still struggle to replicate today. Stepping into a Roman bath, therefore, wasn't just entering a building, it was entering a complex system, a machine fueled by fire, maintained by water, and constructed with sheer, unadulterated genius. The original Dark Associale, the Roman baths were far more than mere washing facilities. Despite the sweat, steam, and splashing, they served as vital centers of information. In an era without smartphones, email, or daily newspapers, the baths acted as informal, open-air communication hubs. Gossip didn't just spread here, it positively frothed senators, merchants, soldiers, and the following script translates the Turkish text in full, adapting the tone to be witty, ironic, and highly engaging for a video format, while significantly expanding the content to meet the length requirement. The Roman spa, where status met steam. Picture this: you're a high-status Roman citizen, maybe a newly minted equestrian or a minor senator, ready for your daily dose of self-care. You don't just go to the spa, you arrive with an entourage. These high rollers would sweep in, accompanied by attendants, often slaves, carrying fresh stacks of towels, oils, and even portable benches. Because, heaven forbid, you might have to sit on a public seat. They could also arrange for private massages or additional services inside rooms. The ancient world, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, was a deeply chaotic place, a cosmic laundry basket perpetually stuffed with invisible powers and spiritual entities. These weren't just abstract concepts, these were very real, very grumpy forces actively influencing your health, your harvest, and your general mood. Yet, amidst this spiritual anarchy, the ancient healers, the SWNW, were attempting something truly revolutionary. They aimed to peel back the curtain, to use a combination of razor-sharp observation, delicate manual skills honed over centuries, and a vast, accumulated body of knowledge to uncover the hidden, often terrifying, aspects of disease. These ancient Egyptian doctors, operating in the hazy overlap between the laboratory and the temple, possessed an impressive arsenal of treatments and formulas. If you walked into their pharmacy, you wouldn't find sterile syringes or blister packs. Instead, their shelves were stacked high with the raw, earthy materials of their world, potent herbs, strange minerals, substances derived from animals, the weirder, the better, often, and essential oils. These physical remedies were rarely administered in isolation. They were almost always combined with surgical techniques, which could be surprisingly sophisticated, and ritualistic prayers or incantations. The result was a comprehensive methodology that fused the elements of natural science, what they could see and test, with profound spiritual symbolism, what they believed controlled the universe. At the very heart of their therapeutic practices lay a document so monumental, so exhaustive, that it serves as the ultimate ancient medical textbook, the Ebers Papyrus. Dating back to approximately 1550 BCE, this sprawling document consists of 110 pages of tightly packed wisdom, or at least, what they considered wisdom. It details more than 700 distinct remedies, covering a staggering spectrum of human misery. We're talking everything from simple stomach ailments and the agonizing grind of a toothache, to complex dermatological issues and the deeply personal struggle of reproductive difficulties. What made these treatments particularly fascinating, and arguably quite modern in their approach, was that they weren't one-size-fits-all prescriptions. Each treatment was meticulously tailored, not just to the specific disease afflicting the patient, but also to that individual's physical condition and, perhaps most tellingly, their social status. Yes, even in ancient medicine, there was a VIP section. If you were a noble, you probably got the good stuff, maybe even a slightly shorter spell. If you were a common laborer, well, you might get the same ingredients, but perhaps a less flattering incantation. The papyrus often includes highly detailed instructions regarding preparation, the grinding, the mixing, the steeping, the precise timing of application, and the method of delivery. Among the most favored materials in the Egyptian pharmacopoeia, one ingredient stands out as universally effective and surprisingly modern: honey. Revered for its potent antibacterial properties, honey was, and remains, a medical superstar. The Egyptians knew its worth, applying it directly to cuts, lacerations, burns, and ulcers. It wasn't just used neat either, it was frequently mixed with other substances, such as crushed seeds or resins, to create powerful, sticky poultices. They also heavily relied on common kitchen staples that we still appreciate today, though perhaps less for their mystical properties. Garlic, onions, juniper berries, and myrrh were all used extensively. And this wasn't just for aroma, which, given some of their other ingredients, was probably a welcome side effect. They were valued for their proven antiseptic and anti-inflammatory qualities. The Egyptians were, in many ways, pioneers in recognizing the power of natural antibiotics, but then, the ancient pharmacy takes a sharp, bizarre turn. Their pharmacopoeia also included materials that, to our modern sensibilities, sound like the punchline of a very dark joke. For instance, imagine walking into the clinic and being prescribed crocodile dung for birth control. Yes, you heard that right. Or perhaps you needed a skin treatment. That might require a topical application of lizard blood. If you were feeling particularly fancy, maybe some hippopotamus oil. And for the truly superstitious, or perhaps those seeking the ultimate placebo, they even utilized pulverized mummified human tissue. Looking back through the lens of history, this approach seems utterly baffling. But it reflects a core belief: the power of the treatment resided not just in the physical properties of the ingredients, the chemistry, but equally in their spiritual significance. A substance was potent because of what it was and what it represented. Take natron, for example. This naturally occurring mineral salt was the Swiss Army knife of ancient Egyptian medicine and ritual. It was used to dry out wounds, to eliminate infection, and, most famously, to preserve bodies for the journey into eternity. Versatile. Copper, known for its antimicrobial properties, was sometimes powdered and incorporated into ointments. Oils derived from the lotus, linseed, and black pepper were employed for massages and pain relief. The dosages and instructions varied according to the specific ailment, but they always maintained that characteristic blend of the practical and the mystical. A typical instruction might read something like this: mix crushed sycamore fruit, honey, and natron. Administer for 4 days. And while applying the mixture, recite the following incantation. In ancient Egypt, the spoken word was a therapeutic tool as vital as the scalpel or the bandage. They genuinely believed that verbal spells activated the healing process. In their view, recovery wasn't solely dependent on the chemical composition of the balm or the precision of the cut, it was deeply tied to the symbolism and divine power embedded within the words themselves. This was far more than mere guesswork or superstition. Egyptian medical practices were highly organized, meticulously documented, and constantly evolving. While some treatments might make us cringe today, many were surprisingly effective, and a few, like the use of honey or the principles of triage, remain relevant, either spiritually or scientifically. Even now, their medical toolkit was sourced from three distinct realms: the natural environment, the human body, often through meticulous observation of injuries, and the divine powers. To promote healing, they appealed to all three. While a significant portion of ancient Egyptian medical practice centered around herbal remedies and spells, they were pragmatists. When the situation demanded it, the Egyptians were perfectly willing to engage in surgical procedures. They understood that some illnesses simply wouldn't yield to prayers or poultices. These required precise skill and, crucially, sharp instruments. The most compelling evidence of Egyptian surgical knowledge is found in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a document dating back approximately 3,600 years. Unlike almost every other ancient text, this document is remarkably modern in its systematic, analytical approach. It reads less like a book of magic and more like a field manual for an army surgeon. The text details 48 specific case studies, mostly involving traumatic injuries, skull fractures, dislocated shoulder blades, spinal injuries. For each case, it provides detailed instructions for examination, treatment, and, critically, the expected outcome. What makes this document so extraordinary is its intensely pragmatic nature. The classification system divides cases into three distinct categories: 1, an ailment I will treat; the treatable cases; 2, an ailment with which I will contend; the manageable, but uncertain, cases; 3, an ailment not to be treated; the hopeless cases. In other words, treatable, ambiguous, and untreatable. This approach is the conceptual ancestor of what we now call triage, the red, yellow, and green classification systems still used in emergency medicine today. They knew when to intervene, when to manage symptoms, and, most importantly, when to simply step back and say, "This is beyond my pay grade." That kind of cold, hard realism is astonishing for the era. Egyptian surgeons employed a variety of tools, mostly crafted from bronze: knives, scalpels, forceps, hooks, and needles. They performed procedures like suturing wounds, draining abscesses, immobilizing broken bones with wooden splints, and, of course, the widespread practice of circumcision. Evidence from mummified remains confirms their success. Many skeletons show signs of successfully healed bones, indicating that patients survived their injuries and lived for many years afterward. They were also early innovators in wound hygiene. Before closing a laceration with stitches, doctors would often disinfect it using substances with antiseptic properties, such as honey, beer, or resin. Following this, they would apply bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures, designed to reduce swelling and promote healing, while they used extracts from the poppy, a source of opium, or soothing herbs for pain relief. There is no evidence of general anesthesia being used. Surgical procedures were likely agonizing, but they were performed quickly and with precision. One particularly notable detail highlights their advanced anatomical understanding. In cases where removing a foreign object, such as an embedded arrowhead, would be more dangerous than leaving it, the Egyptians chose to leave it in the body. This demonstrates a sophisticated awareness of internal anatomy and the wisdom of knowing when not to intervene. Naturally, their surgical practices had limitations. There are no records of internal surgery or extensive amputations. Their understanding of blood circulation and infection was not as developed as modern knowledge. Yet, within the constraints of their time, Egyptian surgeons displayed superior skill. They weren't just experimenting, they were thoughtfully applying knowledge, observing, recording, and passing on their findings through generations. By utilizing bandages and surgical instruments, they laid the foundation for practical, applied medicine, a foundation whose teachings would echo centuries later in Greece, Rome, and eventually, in contemporary surgical practice. This section of the papyri gives us a rare, fascinating insight into how the Egyptians, bless their meticulous, sun-drenched hearts, managed to distinguish between spiritual beliefs and genuinely empirical observations. They didn't always get it right, but they were trying. Take the Kahan papyrus, for example. This is a truly valuable resource, dedicated specifically to women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It's basically the world's first medical textbook that said, "Ladies, we see you, and we know your reproductive system is complicated." It offers detailed information on everything from early birth control techniques, some effective, some less so, methods for diagnosing pregnancy, and even instructions for surgical interventions related to the uterus. Crucially, these texts were not locked away in some secret vault guarded by high priests. Quite the opposite, they were studied openly by scribes and medical practitioners. Many of these practitioners were trained in what were essentially ancient universities, known as the Houses of Life, which were educational centers located right inside the temple complexes. Imagine a temple that was also a terrifyingly comprehensive grad school. In these institutions, medicine was taught alongside the heavy hitters, mathematics, astronomy, and religious law. Medical students had to copy the texts by hand, no photocopiers here, memorize spells, just in case the science failed, and observe experienced doctors during procedures. The Egyptians deeply valued the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations, treating it like a precious heirloom. Every single scroll represented a synthesis of practical experience, careful observation, and that essential dash of divine inspiration, often linked to the gods associated with wisdom and writing. Egyptian healers weren't just glorified paramedics, they carried a vast legacy of accumulated knowledge spanning thousands of years. And here's the kicker. Some of their medical concepts eventually influenced Greek medicine. Yes, even the great figures like Hippocrates and Galen had to grudgingly admit that the Egyptian practices they studied were, in fact, effective. Egypt's role in the development of ancient medicine is undeniably important. While the rest of the world was largely relying on superstition and hoping for the best, Egypt provided the earliest examples of documented, reproducible, and truly organized medical knowledge. Their medical writings, preserved on papyrus rolls, written in ink, and deliberately transmitted, have endured through the ages. While the relentless sands of time have covered their temples and tombs, the influence of ancient Egyptian medical practices has never fully disappeared. In fact, many of their methods, beliefs, and innovations subtly influenced the global evolution of medicine. Their authority is still subtly evident in modern hospitals, pharmacies, and even in contemporary spiritual healing practices. Their systematic approach to health was nothing short of revolutionary. The Egyptians meticulously distinguished symptoms, documented treatments, and made rigorous observations about cause and effect relationships. They developed the first concepts of diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene centuries before the Greeks finally formalized these ideas and took all the credit. Topics like sanitation, daily cleaning routines, the use of antiseptic ointments like honey and natron, basically ancient neosporin, and the importance of bowel regularity anticipated modern public health principles long before that term even existed. They were obsessed with gut health, a true marker of civilization. Their understanding of the mind-body relationship was also surprisingly advanced for their era. Despite lacking any concept of neuroscience, they grasped that mental states could profoundly affect physical health. What they called spiritual distress might now be diagnosed as depression, anxiety, or a psychosocial disorder. Their integrated approach was comprehensive, combining herbal treatments, rituals, and vital community support. And their herbal solutions? They've stood the test of time. Ingredients like garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow bark, the precursor to aspirin, are still used today. Some have been converted into sleek modern pharmaceuticals, while others are still found as dietary supplements in your local health food store. And while they definitely didn't use crocodile dung for birth control, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, their experiments in reproductive health laid crucial early foundations, but perhaps their most enduring legacy is the concept of viewing the healer as both a skilled practitioner and a spiritual guide. In ancient Egypt, the doctor wasn't just a technician responsible for stitching up wounds. They were individuals who understood the very nature of suffering. Their healing approaches spanned the physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions. This human-centered perspective has re-emerged today in holistic medicine, palliative care, and even psychotherapy. The combination of scientific treatment and mystical practices might seem quaint to us now, but it underscores a fundamental, enduring truth. People don't just want to be cured, they want to be seen, comforted, and truly understood. The ancient Egyptian healers realized this, and their scrolls, amulets, and spells were not just clinical treatments, they were demonstrations of compassion. Their medical methods weren't flawless, but they were brave, systematic, deeply curious, and profoundly humane.